Good morning, everyone. Good morning. That's great. You got to start with energy. Who is that guy up there? Anyway, hi, I'm Chris Herbert. I'm the Managing Director of the Joint Center for Housing Studies. I wasn't able to join you for much of yesterday because we were having our own event, which you'll hear about shortly. I was here a bit for the zoning panel, so I was really sorry I missed the day. I heard that there was some really great discussions about taxes and about investors, and so I'll have to catch up. When we were asked by Lincoln to co-sponsor this or co-host this event, David Luberoff, our deputy director, quickly said yes because Lincoln's going to do all the work, host it, invite everybody, and I get to stand up here and say welcome and take credit for, mostly it was Anthony and everybody else at Lincoln. So thank you, Mac, thank you, Anthony, for including us. And my job is to welcome you to day two, to try to draw some connections between the 2 days, which is a little hard because I wasn't here yesterday. So I'm going to make some stuff up. If I get it wrong, please excuse me. But what I want to do is I want to offer some high-level observations on the framing of the convening, the specific topics covered, and that with an eye towards why your job as journalists are so freaking hard when it comes to covering housing. So to start, the focus. The focus of this year's forum is on housing affordability, which is certainly appropriate. I mean, certainly I'd say housing affordability is a challenge we face as a country. If it's not the most significant one, it's certainly the most prevalent and prominent one. I do want to point out, though, it's what I would call one of the big three. And we can probably have a whole forum to describe what the challenges we face and how we bundle them. But my big three are housing affordability, front and center, climate change, so how do we mitigate and adapt the housing stock to climate change, and racial and socioeconomic segregation. And of those three, I think we don't talk nearly enough about the last one. But the challenge that you all have in covering housing is that these are not separate challenges. They're interrelated, right? And so because they're interrelated, that also means the responses to them also have multiple goals. So zoning is a great example of this. So yesterday, David Garcia, is David here? He'll be here. I don't mean to be taking attendance. Where's David? But he made a great point yesterday talking about zoning and how do we evaluate the effectiveness. Now, this was in a panel focusing on affordability, but he noted that zoning reform has multiple goals. And arguably, we could have another debate about which one's more important, but zoning reform is about affordability because we're trying to expand supply. It's really also about climate change because we're trying to have housing that's more accessible to transit and lowers the carbon footprint from where people live. It's also about racial and socioeconomic segregation because we need to have more forms of housing in more diverse places. Okay, so when we have a conversation, we say, what's the impact of zoning about affordability? It gets hard because the reason why we're talking about zoning reform is not because it's just about affordability, it's about all three things. And I would say, and this is a little, it came out in the panel yesterday, I'm not sure that zoning reform is going to move the needle very much by itself in any one of those dimensions. Now, it's the right thing to do because it's going to move us in that direction. But if you're trying to write a headline to say zoning reform is going to have this impact on affordability, it's hard because that impact may not be that big. And what really matters is that it's going to address climate change, it's going to address affordability, it's going to address racial and socioeconomic segregation in a positive, incremental way. So I think that the kind of multiplicity of goals is one challenge. The other thing I would say is Lincoln has done a great job in structuring the forum and focusing on different important levers, right? So zoning, tax policy. Today we're going to talk about financing. We're going to talk about design. And all those are really important levers. But, I think the challenge is that we're often looking for an intervention to be a silver bullet, right? How many times we use that expression, silver bullet? And I heard somebody say, I think it was the woman who's the planner from Minneapolis, I stole this from her, is what we actually need is silver buckshot. Because not just because there's not one silver bullet, but because these interventions by themselves won't work, they have to have multiple interventions that are coordinated. So let me take ADUs as an example. So you can have a zoning change to make ADUs possible, but that's probably not going to do much to produce ADUs. So Portland, Oregon, passed a zoning change in the 90s, said, great, ADUs are allowed. Not much happened. So over time, what they found is one of the things that mattered was that the impact fees charged or the fees charged for occupancies were so high it was deterring use. One of the things they found was that people didn't have an appreciation for what they were, and so they needed to be educated about ADUs, what they were, what they looked like, how they might be useful. They didn't know how to design them, so you needed to have model designs. They didn't know how to finance them. And so just changing zoning by itself isn't going to be a strategy that'll work. You've got to do all those things. And so, as a journalist, you're covering like the zoning reform that somebody just passed about ADUs, and you want to see what the results are going to be. A, it's going to take time, but B, it's also going to be, you got to do a whole bunch of other things, and all those other things happen in other avenues. So that's another challenge, I think. And then lastly, I just also, along these lines, I think it was really interesting. We had, and Dan Dioka, who's here, I'll introduce in a second, at our event yesterday on the state of housing design, which I see some of you thumbing through, that was about the potential for design to influence affordability, adaptation to climate change. And we spent a lot of time yesterday talking about zoning, about financing, about these other things. The other thing I'll flag, we spent a lot of time talking about building codes. And so if we talk about zoning reform, we probably need more building code reform than zoning reform to make a difference. So, but I guess the last thing I want to point to is the other way in which housing is difficult is the scale of the problem and what that implies about the scale of the response. I thought it was yesterday, Liam. Is Liam here from the LA Times? You asked the question of the zoning panel, like, so how much of the problem is this going to solve? And I don't think you got anything like an answer to your question. And I don't blame Jenny and others for not answering it, because A, it's hard, and B, the answer might be, well, not much, right? But it's part of the problem with housing is the scale of the problem is so enormous that these interventions aren't going to move the needle as much as we would hope. But I also think that, and this I would say is the one, and I know you can't do everything, you probably thought about this, just didn't have enough time. The one piece that's missing from this discussion, the session of tools, is subsidies. Because I think as much as we can get financing right, we can get zoning right, we can get property taxes right, ultimately when you're talking about housing people in the bottom quartile of the income distribution, none of those things is going to get there. We got to have subsidies. If we're going to have subsidies, they have to be done at scale. And that becomes really hard to talk about because it's billions of dollars in a way that seems just infeasible. I'd recommend, have people read Homelessness is a Housing Problem by Greg Colburn? If you haven't, I don't see too many hands. This is an endorsement. It's a really interesting book talking about how homelessness, we think of it as a problem of opioids and mental health issues, but he really breaks it down and shows very convincingly how it's a housing affordability problem fundamentally. But what I really appreciate about his book is that at the end, when he starts talking about solutions, he starts talking about the scale of the problem, what's needed. And by not talking about the scale of the problem, we actually end up setting ourselves up to have political failures. So he notes, in Seattle, we've spent a lot of money on homelessness, and the problem has only gotten worse. So people throw up their hands and they say, why, we were wasting our money. But he said, McKinsey did an analysis and said, well, we really want to tackle this problem at scale in the Seattle region. We need to invest $40 billion in affordable housing. And we're spending a couple $100 million, which sounds like a lot, but if you're saying the problem's this big and you're doing this much and you don't have an impact, why are you surprised? But what he does also importantly is he then breaks it down and says, well, could we spend that much? And he starts looking at the tax burden in Washington state and how it compares to other states, and the fact that you could increase the tax burden by about $1,000 and wouldn't be out of whack, and that would start getting you the amount of money you need at scale. So I think we have to address the fact the scale of the problem is an issue and the scale of the response is an issue. And we live in an incremental world, and so we act incrementally, and those increments are important, but it becomes hard to cover it when you want to say, as Liam did, we're going to do this reform, and how much of the problem is it going to solve? And the answer is not much. That's not very satisfying. So I'm glad I'm not a journalist trying to cover these issues. I think it does point to some of the things that we need to do better as researchers too, in terms of communicating the fact that these problems are interrelated, that the responses are incremental, and the scale has to be right. So with that, let me now turn it over to my colleague, Dan Dioka. I'm really glad that the Joint Center could be represented yesterday by Dan, talking about the State of the Nation's Housing Report. Rahul Malhotra, who's the chair of the Urban Planning and Design Department at the GSD, has been urging us for a number of years to say, you've got a great brand, why don't you use that to look at design? And the problem is, I'm an economist. What do I know about design? But we have a lot of colleagues at the GSD who do know. So we finally took Rahul's urging, engaged with Dan, Sam Naylor, who's a really talented architect, and a whole team of students to look at this question of how can design help us address our social challenges in housing. So it's a very different book for us. It's qualitative, it's subjective, it's beautiful, but it's different. And I really hope that it starts to become part of our series of reports that's part of our regular series of reports that we do. I don't know that we'll do it anything like every year. It's a big lift, but it's an important report. And Dan Dioka, who's an associate professor of practice at the GSD, also a partner in Interborough Partners, will hear and share the report with you. So Dan, take it away.